following, and he had a dream, and he dreamt that he wrestled with an angel all night, and that the angel was God, and God, he won.
No, it wasn't a dream. It wasn't an angel, and Jacob certainly did not win. We're still doing the sevens of Revelation. This video is just a quick aside. A Bible study that meets at my work was doing Genesis 34 the other day and having some trouble. Genesis 34 is the wrestling match, where God, in human form, and Jacob go at it for an entire night before Jacob gets renamed Israel. I'm going to explain what's happening in this passage and use this passage as an example for how Christian scholarship sometimes gets it wrong, and try and set us up for why I look at certain passages in Revelation in a slightly non-standard way, and feel totally justified in doing so. Let's start here with a basic modern translation of the events of the wrestling match themselves, and the standard interpretation of those events. Starting at Genesis 32:22. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that the hip was wrenched, as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Then the man asked him, "What's your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." All right, what was that? In translating the Bible, word choice is important, obviously. Sometimes even closely related words can lead to wildly different interpretations, as we try and visualize what we're reading. So, when it says, wrestled till daybreak, we assume that these two are physically grappling for at least 8 hours. No wonder Professor Peterson took this as a dream, since you can only physically wrestle someone for a couple of minutes before lactic acid builds up and begins to destroy your muscle tissues. That Hebrew verb, translated as wrestled, literally means to acquire dirt. Thus, just straight from Hebrew, it says, in Hebrew, they got dirty until daybreak. Now, you can see that's a little more vague. Got dirty how? What were they doing that caused them to acquire dirt? We really need more context. And good news, the passage is about to tell us. At the end of this workout, whatever it was, our basic translation tells us that our divine personage saw that he could not overpower Jacob. This is why Peterson said Jacob won. That word we're translating as overpower makes it sound like it's a contest, and for some reason the Almighty isn't all that mighty because he's not winning. Bad word choice number 2. The word here comes from a root for endurance. It's a root meaning it's not saying Jacob won, it's just saying that he didn't quit. Next, horrible word choice. When it says touched, it makes us think that our divine figure is going so poorly in the wrestling match that he has to resort to miraculous power to disable this guy. No, the word here is naga, and like so many other ancient words, it had wide application, anything from simple contact to ballistic impact. Again, we need context, but for this, we already have the context. They're getting dirty, and this wrenches his hip. There's aggressive movement taking place, and Jacob isn't backing down. He isn't quitting. In that context, this isn't a gentle touch. Here, in a minute, I'll put it all together. When I do, my word won't be touch or reach or strike. It's going to be twist. He twists his hip. I'll explain when we get there. Last, troubling word choice. The divine figure makes like he is trying to leave in some way. Jacob says, "I won't release. I won't let go." Again, it should probably say, "I won't give up until you bless me." What's the blessing? Next to salvation, this is the biggest blessing ever given in the entire Bible. But you have to understand the word. Israel. Israel. A mashup of 3 Hebrew words. Stiff, prince, and God. Literally, stubborn prince of God. Weird, I know. But did they get he who wrestles with God out of stubborn prince of God? Why did they do that? Well, by the time we get to an NIV translation like this one, they probably just assumed, based on their earlier translations, that it had to refer to what had just happened, even if wrestles with God didn't make much sense. And I'm not trying to bag on the NIV editors. They fixed a lot of stuff going from the King James. But I don't think this was right at the top of their radar. When I looked for images of the wrestling match, it kept trying to autofill coloring book, like this is a kid's story, and we don't spend time on it in our serious adult Bible studies. Peterson actually does a nice job here. He takes wrestle as a metaphor for dynamic interaction, and takes the passage as saying that the true followers of God are the ones that engage with God through the hard times and everything else. Not bad, but not what it's saying. No, in the ancient world, nothing like our modern secondary education system existed. Even most serious scribes only learned to read and write and not much else. Almost nobody received a general, universal education. Nobody except for the princes. After all, they might need that knowledge, every bit of knowledge. Who knows what a ruler would need to govern a country? So a legitimate attempt was made to teach them everything. That's why something like our Proverb 19:10 here sounds elitist to us, when really what Solomon was saying was that the people in charge should be the people that have been trained to carry out the necessary functions of their rule. Now, let's go back and look at how that passage played out, with the appropriate word choices in place. With all that in mind, this is what happened. Jacob was about to cross over and face his brother, who he'd fled from years before. He was frightened. He wanted a little alone time before facing Big Brother. While praying, sacrificing, or just gathering his courage, he received a visitor, the angel of the Lord, God in human form. This happened to his granddad, and Abraham recognized him as a divine being right away. Jacob probably did as well. Why? Did he have wings? Was he glowing? Was he just way too clean for the ancient Middle East? Don't know. Doesn't matter. Their conversation turned to Jacob's fears. Jacob, you see, had gone from living under the protection of his father Isaac to the protection of his father-in-law Laban, both of whom were essentially warlords with their own private armies, to now having to face his possibly murderous older brother, who now too had his own private army. You know who didn't have his own private army? Jacob. And later in the passage, we have our verb for persevere. So the angel of the Lord clearly begins the getting dirty portion of events with some sort of challenge. Something like, of course you're scared, Jacob. You're not a fighter, and you never were. Jacob, for his part, must have countered with something like, maybe not, but I could learn. You could teach me. What follows is quite possibly history's first training montage. What did he do? Make him run around, pick up rocks, show him how to properly grip a sword? Don't know, doesn't matter. At some point, the angel of the Lord demonstrates something like an ankle lock. I love the idea of our pre-incarnate Christ knowing jujitsu. He does something that wrenches Jacob's hip. Why? Because that's what had been happening the entire time. This whole thing is like the scene from An Officer and a Gentleman, where the drill sergeant is trying to get Mayo to quit. Our divine personage is challenging Jacob to give up. Jacob refuses. He presses on. His version of, I've got nowhere else to go, is essentially, I'm about to die unless you bless me, unless you do something to change the math. And the answer he gets sets up literally everything else that happens after this in the Bible. Here's your blessing, Jacob. Your name, your very identity is no longer Jacob, trickster, the Loki to Esau's Thor. Your new name is Israel, he who is, in other words, won't quit. Sra, in other words, trains the way princes train. And El, a word for God. So does this for God. He who trains with God. And like I said before, next to salvation, eternal life in heaven, this is the greatest gift anyone is ever given in the Bible. Think of whatever your favorite activity or hobby is. Now imagine the ultimate practitioner of that craft in the world offers to personally train you until you become as good as they are. What are you going to buy with money that compares to that? You want to learn to wrench a hip? Okay, here's Rickson Gracie. He's going to personally train you until you can do it as well as he can. We don't know what the training looked like for the rest of Jacob's life. All we know is that it marked a turning point. Up until this moment, he was very pagan in his thinking. Very pagan. So pagan that right before this, we have him using basic contagion spell magic. That's what he was doing with those branches in Mesopotamian magic. Like beget like. So mating next to speckled and spotted branches, assuming you perform the correct ritual, was supposed to make the speckled and spotted baby goats. All this in order to make Jacob richer. Typical pagan thinking, typical pagan goal. We find out later it worked because God made it work. But God didn't want him to keep thinking like a pagan. Contagion magic is what we now call childish superstition. Step on a crack, break your mother's back, that sort of thing. And that's not what God wanted for Jacob, or for us, to learn his true relationship with the world around him. Jacob, his first step to mastering that world was to learn to see God as he truly is. And we see a step in that direction in chapter 35, right after the wrestling match, where Jacob has his family throw out all of their idols. Jacob is now dynamically interacting. Yes, but with what? Not with an unthinking, uncaring force of nature, not wrestling with God, but interacting with him like he's a teacher, a trainer, someone intimately involved in shaping the change that's happening in Jacob's life. We could go on with the applications of that image of a true believer as the ones who show up to the dojo or the boot camp karate class where a ton of people show up and put on the white belt, but only a few stick with it because only a few truly care and are willing to sacrifice for the thing that they're being trained in. The main thing I wanted to show here is why sometimes a fresh set of eyes, someone who didn't go through seminary but who has a wealth of life experience and has been studying this stuff all his life, might be able to correct those rare mistakes made even by eminent scholars. I mean, they may know way more than I'll ever know about Hebrew, but if they were never inside of a dojo, they might not know what a sparring session looks like when they see one. I promise you, experience counts. That goes for everyone listening here as well. Don't be afraid to call BS when you see something that doesn't quite jive with the world as you know it. Maybe you're wrong. We all want to have a little bit of healthy skepticism. But every once in a while, you're going to be right. Because you're the one who has the experience to know what that passage is really saying. This is David Reichert from The Bunker. Our second book, Fluid Shock, is now available from our publisher or from Amazon. Don't miss the next book in our award-winning pandemic horror series, The Holocaust Engine. Link below.